Welcome to Simply Science from Nature Education. I'm Adam Weiss, and I'm here at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution with senior scientist Ken Buesseler, who's someone who looks at the twilight zone of the ocean, the place between the little bit at the top and the little bit at the bottom that most people examine, and looks at how important that is to the rest of the planet. Ken, welcome.
Thank you.
So you look at what is most of the ocean, right? It's not the little skin at the top that everything lives in that we see, and the part at the bottom that you kind of see in the movies looking at the bottom of the ocean, but the bulk of the mile or two of water in between, right?
Yeah, often it's ignored that there's a whole region of the ocean that there's not enough sunlight. That's what we call it the twilight zone, but it's also quite mysterious. And so to me, twilight zone also is Rod Serling's show in the 60s of what are the mysteries of the ocean. And one of the remaining mysteries is how material gets from the surface to the bottom, how quickly, and along the way, what the animals do to eat that material. That's their food source. And a lot of the survivability, the fisheries and other animals out there survive on this sinking marine material, marine snow we call it, that comes from the surface and settles to the bottom.
And this marine snow is mostly dead stuff, right? It's the things that live at the top, and particles, whether they're individual tiny, tiny animals or bits of whatever's up there, that falls down and gets eaten by the things that live in that twilight zone.
Exactly, and then the questions are, well, what types of things are getting through? At the surface of the ocean, if you look out, you see a forest of microscopic algae. You can't see them without a microscope, but they're really important in photosynthesis. They produce a lot of carbon, organic matter, and that's the food then for the small krill that wants to eat that, little copepod animals, the complex food webs that develop around this food source. So they're eating each other, and as they move up the food chain, a bit of that comes out either as a dead animal that sinks. Some of these marine phytoplankton have shells, sort of like the seashells on the shore here, but they're much smaller, of course, so that makes them sink faster. Some of it goes into the gut of an animal, and they produce fecal matter the same way we actually do. So that material, fecal matter, sinks to the ocean. And so a lot of our goal is to find different places of the ocean and try and study what type of material and how deep it gets, and that's quite important for isolating and separating the surface and bottom. And that kind of depth scale, if you tell me how deep it gets, I can tell you how long it's going to stay there. It's really that kind of simple.
And the way you study that is by doing the same thing that those animals in that region do, catching it, and instead of eating it, you bring it back to the lab.
Right, so I put out a little cup or a tube that's called a sediment trap, much like the rain gauges in your garden for collecting rain. The trick is to take that material, put them out there for several days, get them back. It's not always easy. It's stormy out there. Ships, can break down. Your material can get lost. But you bring back these precious little samples and then distribute them among your friends who are biologists or chemists, looking at the source of that material if you're a biologist, what they've been eating by the stomach contents that you can tell from what their fecal matter, and then in my case the chemical composition, and even some rare isotopes that tell me a little bit about how old that material was when it left the surface. So we can also do isotopic analysis, more very sophisticated analyses back in the lab. That's where I spend most of my time. If I'm out on the ocean for a week collecting samples, I can spend a year back in the lab analyzing those few samples.
And that analysis that you do, plus what your colleagues do looking at the other aspects of it, can teach us quite a bit about what's in the ocean, can't it?
And can teach us a lot about the whole global system if we're talking about our release of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, what fraction of that gets into these marine plants, and then how much gets into the deep ocean. I like to say if it all stays on the surface, it's like growing a lawn. You're not going to get much of that carbon out into the deep ocean if it all decays and dies right at the surface layer. But if you can get a little bit down deep, and the deeper the better, it's like growing redwood trees or getting some sort of a long-term storage of carbon in the deep ocean. So how much and how deep are really important questions that we don't understand very well.
So you are looking at these things, you're looking at how this interacts with the rest of the planet, and this section of the ocean that you look at really seems to make up a big chunk of what goes on out there, even though it's not the part that everybody looks at.
Yeah, and it's some ways, I think it's the most important part, but if you're studying that biological uptake process, that's confined to where there's light, and that's really not that deep in the ocean. You can also see that with satellites. So as you look down on the surface, from boats it's easy to see the top, right? The deep submersibles, the underwater volcanoes, are really neat and cool, their own ecosystems, but really that interior ocean, it's the largest volume by far, and it really separates the massive amount of recycling that goes on the surface from the little bit of storage in the deep ocean. And that's a link that we know very little about. I keep saying those words, but it really is this mysterious twilight zone region that we think needs further study, and we're out studying almost every year, certainly.
Well, it certainly sounds interesting what you're finding in there, and it's great that there are people out there looking at this bulk of the ocean that people haven't really examined too much in the past. Thank you very much for what you do, and thank you for telling us all about it.
Glad to be here.